The Irrawaddy, one of the great rivers of Asia, rises on the southern rim of Tibet, flows south for 1,000 miles, and empties into the sea between India to the west and Thailand to the east. Its wide, fertile valley, hot and wet, spangled with lakes, rich with rice fields, is the heart of Burma. The land is dominated by Buddhism. The faith was brought here by holy men from India 300 years before the birth of Christ. But the Lord Buddha didn't displace the ghosts and spirits, the nats, in whom the people had already believed since before history began. He simply took his place alongside them, and they continued to dwell throughout the land that they had occupied since its very creation, in the rivers and the waterfalls, the rocks and the mountains, in the bodies of animals, and in the spreading branches of the trees. The land, indeed, is a rich one. The forests are still thick with immense hardwood trees, teak and mahogany, and the animals of the forest, the elephants and the buffalo, tamed and obedient to the ways of man, still provide the power for dragging out the gigantic and immensely valuable logs. The jungles of Burma, like its people, do not yield easily to the innovations of the West. Young elephants, still not big enough to work, spend their first years alongside their labouring mothers, watching the tasks that they themselves will have to tackle when they're full grown. The capital of Burma, Rangoon, stands on the flat, low-lying delta of the Irrawaddy. During the rainy season, it is so humid you can be drenched with sweat within minutes. In the dry season, it's suffocatingly hot and airless. Every main street has its water cellars. Most of them are aware of the modern Western obsession with cleanliness and hygiene, and obligingly do their best to cater for it. You can also buy your horoscope on the pavements. Palmists, in order to show that they're really smart and up-to-date, advertise their claims in English and draw their occult designs with a smart Western fountain pen. A roadside horoscope like this is for the less well-to-do. The Burmese place such a belief in astrology that wealthy men employ their own full-time fortune tellers, and even government decisions may be influenced by their pronouncements. During the 19th century, Burma was part of the British Empire. But after the Second World War, the Burmese reclaimed their independence. And since then, they have virtually shut their doors to outsiders. The buildings of the city centre, put up a century ago to house a colonial administration, have been taken over by shopkeepers or turned into tenements. Virtually no new cars have been allowed into the country since independence. Those that the Burmese still have, they manage to keep going by a process of cannibalization, using parts extracted from one exhausted vehicle to prolong the life of another. Some replacement parts are even manufactured here, for metal casting is an ancient skill, and craftsmen who can produce a bronze Buddha can also cast a crankshaft. A branch of the Irrawaddy, wide, brown and tepid, flows to the city. For all its isolation, Rangoon is still a busy port, and its river still the main highway to the interior of the country. Indeed, this is the road to Mandalay, 400 miles upstream, that Kipling wrote about. Can't you hear their paddles chunking from Rangoon to Mandalay? On the road to Mandalay, where the flying fishes play, and the dawn comes up like thunder out of China across the bay. There are no tall modern buildings in Rangoon. None are allowed to be built, for the city is and must remain dominated by the symbol of the faith of the people, the Shwe Dagon Pagoda. Every morning, monks from the pagoda walk the streets in silence, carrying begging bowls. The people gladly give them rice. This act is of great importance to both those that receive and those that give. For Buddhists believe that life is a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. A cycle that must be broken if a soul is to find rest. And that can only be done by gaining merit through such pious and charitable acts as these. At the end of the procession come young boys who've only just entered the monastery. Buddhist nuns also come out daily from the pagoda, silently to seek alms, and yet again provide the townsfolk with a chance to make merit. Merit can be acquired even after death. This is a funeral procession. The old lady, whose body is being carried through the streets for burial, left provision in her will for a final act of charity, throwing money to the poor. In life, the old lady had been particularly devout. She had given the monastery a whole new building, and so, by special dispensation, her body, in its coffin, may be shaded on its last journey by golden umbrellas, an honor normally reserved for the funerals of monks and their close relatives. Many of the monks themselves attend the ceremony to pay her a final honor and help her soul on its long passage towards the release of extinction. All Burmese men at some time in their lives must become monks. Most enter when they're young boys, and the day they do so is one of the most important in their whole lives. The preparations are elaborate. A boy must have his face carefully made up, and he must wear the most beautiful and sumptuous clothes his parents can afford. He must, in effect, be dressed and decorated like a prince, and so make the greatest possible contrast to the life of abstinence and poverty that he is about to follow, perhaps for a few months, perhaps, if he proves to have a true vocation, for the rest of his life. Over his white shirt, he wears a harness of gilded leather decorated with glinting fragments of glass. Resplendent in their costumes, the boys are carried to the Shui Dagon pagoda by their older brothers or their fathers. Girls, too, are carried in procession, for they also have a part to play in this great occasion. The pagoda is the spiritual heart of the city. Tradition maintains that it was miraculously founded at the very moment that the Lord Buddha received his enlightenment, and claims that beneath its vast solid mound of brickwork there lie some sacred hairs from his head. Certainly it's the largest and oldest shrine of its kind in all the world. For 1,000 years the kings of Burma have striven to acquire merit for themselves and their souls by building the Shui Dagon still higher and adding yet more layers of gold to the glittering sheath that encases it. Its spire today rises over 300 feet high. It's hung with countless bells of silver and gold, and at its very top it carries an orb studded with over 4,000 diamonds. Each day of the week has a section of the pagoda dedicated to it. All Burmese know from consulting an astrologer that one of the week's days is of supernatural importance to them, and it's in that day's corner that they must worship, by pouring water over the image of Buddha in just the same ancient way that they pay homage to the gnats. Pregnant women can seek good fortune by praying beside two special stone boulders. Depending on whether they feel heavy or light, she should be able to tell whether her child will be a boy or a girl. And everywhere in the temple, alongside the Buddhas, stand images of the ancient spirits, the gnats. To many, their presence in the pagoda is fully as important as that of the Buddha himself. Novices have at last reached the main platform of the Shui Dagon. The flame-like decorations of gilded leather that they wear on their wrists and shoulders are symbols of spiritual force, which also appear on images of the gnats. For the boys on this day are not merely princes, but princes who are invested with supernatural power. The first prayers of the ceremony are said, but once again these are directed not to the Buddha, but to the two gnats, the spirits of a woman and her husband, who are the special guardians of the Shui Dagon. Only after they have been acknowledged may the spirit of the Buddha be invoked. The first part of the children's committal has been made. Before there are further rituals, there must be celebrations. By the children, because they're on the threshold of a greater intimacy with the gods that will shape their lives. By their parents, because on this day, they are making one of the greatest possible acts of merit, the giving of a child to the service of the monastery and the Buddha. All the initiates must be driven ceremonially around the city so that everyone may share in their joy. The moment of dedication has arrived. Although the girls on this occasion will not follow their brothers into the monastery, they must have their ears pierced. The boys must be shaven-headed, just as the Buddha was when he left his palace to take up a life of holy poverty. Sharing the ceremony with the boys are grown men, for people may return to the monastery many times throughout their lives, after a bereavement, in order to study, or simply to seek refuge from the turmoil of the outside world. All must lose their hair, for the Buddha wished all mankind to be equal, and princes and commoners are indistinguishable when they're shaven-headed and clad in saffron robes. Now the abbot asks for their vows. All day long and late into the evening, prayers are said at the Shui Dagong. Pilgrims may have travelled for weeks to visit this most sacred of shrines, women from the town come to ask for particular boons, and children are brought to make their first prayers. And every day, a particular quarter of the city sends volunteers to sweep the great pagoda clean and gather the remains of spent offerings. That evening, the guests who have come to witness the boys' initiation are entertained in one of the courtyards of the pagoda by dancing. In the old days, the candle dance was performed with oil lamps instead of candles, and then even greater skill was needed to make sure that no drop of oil was spilled. Burmese orchestras contain several instruments that are found nowhere else in the world. This is the sighing wine, a circle of tuned drums on which the leader of the orchestra improvises with brilliant virtuosity. For centuries, Burmese celebrations have included performances by huge puppets. But these are not puppets, they're human dancers. The Burmese say that puppets set the standards which a good dancer should strive to match. And at no time is this more difficult than in this engaging dance when, as they say, dancers have simultaneously to forget and to remember. To forget their human anatomy and to remember that they're marionettes. The capital of Burma has, for 1,000 years, been one of the most sophisticated cities of the Orient, where music and dancing reached its highest pinnacles of refinement. But outside the capital, in the vast forests and lakes of the country to the north, life has remained much simpler. The people who live on Lake Inle, 200 miles north of Rangoon, have developed their own unique method of rowing. It's a style calling for great strength of leg and marvelous balance, and yet everybody, even the youngest, seem to be able to do it. The lake itself is full of fish, and men from villages all around it make their living from them. Many villages stand on piles, for the lake is very shallow, and people may go for months on end without setting foot on dry land. Earth is brought from the shore and dumped on platforms to create floating fields on which the people grow vegetables. There are even large pagodas supported on piles. The lake is surrounded by jungle-covered hills where the Shan people still preserve their ancient animistic beliefs, and dancers, costumed as fabulous animals, come out to perform in public, accompanied by a simple orchestra of gongs and cymbals. These are kinaras, half bird, half human, posturing with the trembling splendor of the displaying peacocks and pheasants that strut in the surrounding forests. Every year, in October, a great festival is held on the lake, during which teams of men from different villages compete in what must be one of the most extraordinary regattas in the world. Each day, the competition is held in a different village, so that by the time it's over, it has completed a circuit right round the shores of the lake. West of Lake Inle, on the banks of the upper Irrawaddy, stands the ruins of an ancient city that 1,000 years ago was the capital of the country, Pagan. One of its temples stands on the very edge of the riverbank and provides the people travelling up and down the river with a landmark that they can see in this flat country for many miles in either direction, the Bupya Pagoda. In the 12th century, when the power of Burma was at its height, Pagan was one of the greatest religious centres in the whole of Southeast Asia. Temples lined the Irrawaddy for a distance of 20 miles in a dense band 5 miles deep. Then there were 13,000 of them. Even today, over 5,000 still stand. The kings of Pagan believed that every temple they built brought them merit, and that if they built sufficient, they might even achieve the status of a Buddha. And they and their people labored industriously to do so. The earliest temples were solid mounds, which sometimes, like the Shwedagon, contained an important relic. But later they came to be regarded more as homes for the gods and spirits, and they were built with hollow interiors in which images were placed. And here in Pagan, many of these still retain paintings of the Buddha on their walls and ceilings. The Buddhist faith came from India, and its origins are nowhere plainer than here, for alongside Buddha are carvings of the great Hindu god Brahma, the creator of all. Among the temples stand other religious buildings, a library built to house 30 elephant loads of Buddhist scriptures that one of the kings of Pagan ordered to be brought here. The most important temple of all, the Ananda Pagoda, has been in continuous use since it was founded at the end of the 11th century. Long corridors run through its vast rectangular base, which is pierced here and there with tunnel-like windows, letting in shafts of light. In niches along the walls, sculptures and engravings illustrate the life of Buddha, shaving his head and riding off to seek enlightenment supported by angels. And this is Chansiptha, king of Pagan, who founded this temple. The core of the building is formed by a gigantic cube of solid masonry, on each side of which stands a huge figure of the Buddha, 30 feet high, and coated from head to toe by layer upon layer of gold leaf. But although the temples are dedicated to the Buddha, the builders of the city entrusted its protection not to his gentle spirit, but to the powers of the gnats, for they placed effigies of them in niches guarding either side of the city gates. Some gnats are the ghosts of particular historical figures. The most powerful of these are a family headed by a blacksmith of superhuman strength. They inhabit a temple on top of a high volcanic mountain in the center of Burma, Mount Popa. The blacksmith was murdered by a king jealous of his influence. After his death, his spirit caused so much trouble that it had to be given this special shrine and granted royal rank to placate it. And now here the whole family stands. As well as such heroes and heroines and the spirits of nature, the gnats also include spirits who are clearly closely related to the gods of India. Indeed, many Burmese regard Buddha himself as one of them. People can communicate with the gnats by dancing. A worshipper hopes that as she goes into trance, the gnat may come down and occupy her body. A female gnat, they believe, prefers to enter a man's body, so an entranced devotee becomes, in a sense, bisexual. This dancer, in fact, is a woman, but very often gnat dancers, equally graceful and flirtatious, are actually men in women's clothing. The gnats demand worship. If they're not properly treated, they may take terrible revenge. Many Burmese believe that it was neglect of the gnats that on July the 8th, 1975, brought disaster to Pagan. A tremendous earthquake shook the city. Rents appeared in walls and tall spires rocked and crashed to the ground. Over 1,000 of the temples were severely damaged. Restoration work has now begun, but it'll take decades to repair the damage caused by a few minutes of violence. The bronze umbrella on top of the Ananda Pagoda fell and was smashed beyond repair. The tower itself cracked apart. It's now being painstakingly patched up. In the bottom of one of the cracks, the masons discovered votive offerings that had been sealed within the mound when it was first dedicated 900 years ago. They rededicated them and sealed them up once more, this time within a tangle of steel rods surrounded by solid concrete. The second most revered temple in Pagan, the Shrey Zigon, was also badly damaged. Its mound has now been completely restored, but the shimmering skin of gold that once covered it has not yet been replaced. That must come from Mandalay. Mandalay is the center for all crafts in Burma. Here, workers make gold leaf by beating sheets of this most malleable of metals between pieces of leather. Ultimately, the gold becomes so thin that it will float in the air. The leaves of gold are then packed between sheets of oiled paper, a task that requires the greatest skill and practice. Eventually, traders will take the gold to pagodas all over the country. There it will be sold to the faithful and laid on the surface of the stupas to refurbish their golden glory and bring merit to those who paid for it. The catastrophe at Pagan brought other urgent work for the craftsmen of Mandalay. New statues of the Buddha were needed, and Mandalay can provide them in all sizes. These craftsmen are always busy, for the people believe that the simple act of setting up a Buddha image is in itself meritorious. So even without the exceptional demands from Pagan, the market for images is continuous and huge. As well as giant versions in marble, Mandalay produces many small ones. They're cast in bronze using the same technique as was used 2,000 years ago. A model, perfect in every detail, is made in wax around a central core of clay. While it's being finished elsewhere in the foundry, a charcoal furnace is being fanned to a high temperature with bellows like pistons. This is the power that will ultimately melt the metal. When at last the image is finished, it will be wrapped in a thick coat of clay and then fired so that the clay around it and in its core is baked hard. The wax melts and drains away, leaving behind it a hollow mould. A crucible full of metal is brought to 2 such moulds that have been fired and are ready for casting. One spout will receive the molten metal, the other provides an escape for air and gases. As soon as it cools, the mould is broken away. The image needs little more than the removal of the metal pegs that held the central clay core in position, and a careful burnishing. Pagan, after 2 centuries of splendor, was eventually conquered and sacked by Mongol nomads from China to the north, under their great leader Kublai Khan. Marco Polo, the Venetian traveller, brought back reports of its looting to Europe. The Burmese kings eventually built themselves a new capital farther up the Irrawaddy, first at Ava and then close by at Amarapura. It too, after a few centuries, was abandoned. Ruins of stone and brick still stand, but most of the city's buildings were of timber, and they have long since disappeared. It was here, at Amarapura, at the end of the 18th century, that the British sent an envoy to try and persuade the King of Burma to assist them in their quarrels with the French, who were also trying to expand their territories and influence in this part of the world. The Burmese ultimately agreed to allow a British resident to settle in their country, and it's from these missions that Europe first received detailed accounts in words and watercolors of this marvelous Oriental kingdom, of the ornate splendors of its pagodas and palaces, of the capital itself, tolerably clean, they said, and free from the closeness and offensive smells of most Indian towns, and of the settlements that stood on the banks of the long, winding Irrawaddy. And it was in such palaces as these, richly decorated with gilded wooden ornament and covered in carvings, that Europeans saw for the first time the dazzling, sophisticated performances given by the dancers of the royal court. Dancers start their training when they're about 8 years old and take 6 months or so to learn the complete movements of just one dance. Thereafter, they must practice every day if their bodies are to become sufficiently supple and flexible to execute the movements properly. Ideally, fingers should be long, and constant practice should make them capable of bending backwards in a graceful curve. The dancer must have complete muscular control of her head and neck so that she can make the movements that are inherited from the traditions of India. The feet must be placed flat on the ground and do little more than emphasize the rhythm and kick back the longi, the traditional skirt. A certain jerkiness is regarded as a quality. It recalls those models of excellence, puppets, and it must be striven for in these daily practices. Although the technique of this dance has its origins in India, the purpose of dance in Burma is much more straightforward. Whereas the movements of the hands and fingers of an Indian dancer have very precise meanings, the Burmese dancer's hands convey nothing more than grace. Indeed, her performance as a whole seldom tells a particular story or attempts to express deep emotion. It's never sad. Instead, she seeks to be rhythmic, beautiful, and joyous. And the only response she seeks from those who watch her is a straightforward delight in her technical brilliance and virtuosity. Sophisticated though it is, Burmese dance is not by any means solely the delight of the wealthy, leisured courtiers of the palace. It's always been greatly enjoyed by the people at large. And at the beginning of the new year, in April, dancers from all over Mandalay perform in the streets. In every quarter of the city, full-scale orchestras are playing to rapt audiences. Nearly all societies have special times of the year, fiesta, carnival, Halloween, when, for a day or so, the restrictions and repressions that normally control people are lifted, and all kinds of freedoms, unthinkable at other times, are allowed. And this is what happens in Burma on these 4 days in April. While dancers perform hour after hour on specially built platforms, bands of students drive round on lorries, chanting political satires, mocking and criticizing their rulers. The whole event is organized into a competition with judges carefully assessing the merits of the chants and their criticisms and awarding marks. some 20 different lorry loads of students will pass the judges before the night is over. Prizes will be awarded to those whose chants have the greatest originality and strike closest to the truth. Daytime brings another kind of celebration, Thinjan, the water festival. Originally, Thinjan was a time when everyone throughout Burma ensured that all the nats, including the Buddha, were worshipped by pouring water over them in the traditional way, so that the whole country everywhere would be simultaneously purified and the nats be ready and willing to take it into the new year. But those somewhat austere rituals are now hardly discernible. April is, after all, the hottest time of the year, and if, in addition, you believe that getting doused at this time brings you good luck, then you might as well abandon yourself and enjoy it. The revelers regard it as such a privilege to be thoroughly soaked to the skin that they actually queue up to drive past the batteries of hoses that are stationed beneath the dancing platforms. After 4 days of exhausting revelry, Thinjan at last comes to an end. The gods have been restored, revered, and revived. The Buddha has received his due, the gnats have been placated. With their approval, life can now return to normal. Within a few weeks, the monsoon will come, bringing rains to the rice fields. Burma is launched on yet another year.